So there's a misconception that if you're single, you are incomplete, perhaps damaged, salvaged, and you won't be happy until you find your one. And that is not true. That is bullshit. It is a message that has been fed to us by media and advertising. The truth is, when you're single, you have the richest soil for growth. That's why I created this podcast. And unlike other podcasts, this one is host-driven, not guest-driven. That means I will be rotating health and wellness experts 3 times a week to give you the giant box of wellness crayons, not just the primary colors, so you can start building a meaningful life. It's time to give singlehood a cape.
Hi, MC.
Hi, Paul. How are you?
I'm great. And we are back.
We are back.
To follow up on disclosing trauma in new relationships.
Part 2.
Part 2. MC, you reached out to me and you felt that we left a lot on the table. And I agree. This is a heady topic and one that deserves a bit more discussion, driven by you, who, for people who do not know, is a Ph.D. researcher in trauma, coach, and author. Yeah. And I am Paul Chamberlain, known as the smart, funny, tortured coach, who has seen his fair share of trauma and been through relationships, identifies as bisexual, and is enjoying a really good part of life now that some of these things are behind me. And God, I wish these conversations existed when I was single and dating. So, MC, what pops up? What comes to mind that we immediately need to address or share with people?
Well, so I think if you're listening and you haven't listened to our first podcast, go back and do that, because we kind of lay the groundwork for trauma in relationships, why it's important to disclose, and also negotiation in this space. But I think we spent so much time, necessary time, laying that groundwork that we didn't really get into the specifics. And so I thought we might go through, 3 different points at which you might need to or want to disclose trauma in a relationship and what that can look like. So we could do like when you have to disclose in the very beginning, which we talked about a little bit on part 1, and then in the middle, and then what about if it's a, long-term relationship and something is coming up. So just to give people lots of tools and understanding of how this can look at different points in relationship.
Yeah, I think that's great to go in chronological order, because we did touch on date 2 or 3 when you do have to disclose stuff, and then also the competitive or comparative aspect when you both possess trauma. So early in a relationship.
So some of this will be review, right? But if you want to disclose something like, let's get an example. And this is actually interesting, because when I was thinking of these examples, I could think of 22 examples for middle of a relationship and then long-term relationship when something pops up. But in the beginning of the relationship, I was really struggling. What do you think would be a good example for us to work with of something you'd need to disclose on date 2? We talked about kind of personal experiences last time, but if we can think of like a more,
The first thing that comes to mind is obviously something within the sexual realm, whether it's disclosing identity or past experience of which you were a victim. And that you feel that you're straying into an area that could dismantle, disrupt, or destroy what you got going. Yeah.
Okay, so let's get specific, right? You're on date 3. You think this is going to go somewhere sexual, and you've got something you need to say before you move from dinner to the bedroom.
Yeah.
Okay. I think the first thing is to plan a script. Not that you're going to plan the entire thing because you've got another person in the conversation, but I think having a really solid understanding of what you want to say and what you don't want to say is really helpful ahead of time. So, because I think one of the things that happens with people who are survivors of trauma is that it's very tempting to over-explain. And it's hard to remember that the person that you're on this date with, because it feels very important and precarious, it's only date 3. So in all likelihood, like, you know this person a little bit, but not super well. Do you want to go into your entire backstory? Right?
No. And you're falling into this intimacy, this like, oh, this is somebody that can hold space for me. This is great. This is wonderful.
Right.
You know, thirsty person drinking kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
And like you said, you don't know that this person's going to be able to necessarily do that. And you could, this could really get in the way of the thing you've been building. So I think this happens particularly. So you brought up the example of, like, let's say you're a survivor of sexual assault. You don't have to go into detail. You don't have to share anything you're not comfortable sharing. You can if you want to, right? But I think it's really important for victims of trauma to have autonomy in this space of dating, and to not feel like they have to give over their entire history to someone. Like, so let's say you had an abusive relationship, right? And you had sexual violence in that relationship. You don't need to go into, again, unless you want to, how that relationship started, where your shame is when it comes to staying in that relationship, if that is a thing, right? Mm-hmm. You can just say, I'm someone for whom relationship violence has been a thing, and here are my parameters. That's it.
You know, what happened in my experience before is that my disclosure caused their disclosure.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Or their disclosure pushed me to go, okay, since we're sharing, I'm bi. I've had experiences with men. And then it literally created, everybody went back to their respective corners for a couple of weeks and processed, and then came back together.
Freaked out. So you didn't have the experience of like, oh, we both, no, oh wow, okay.
Yeah, there was no high fives over the table. It was like, eek. Yeah. So are you often prepared to, I have just disclosed this. Wow, I'm so glad you're bringing this out in the open because this happened to me. And then it's like, oh, be careful what you wished for. Shit, I'm on the other side now.
Yeah. I mean, I think, like, I'm so glad you're bringing this up, because that's kind of, I didn't have that specific idea in mind. But when I said a minute ago to plan a script, make sure that you include the fact that there's a question mark in that script, mm-hmm. right? So know the things you want to say, but also be open to the fact that things are going to come back. And that, I was thinking, like, judgment or questions you might not be ready to answer. Things like that. But it could very well be, I have this other thing that I want to disclose. And
oh my God, you too? Wow.
Right.
Okay.
Let me tell you, and that can easily go into what we were talking about last time with the, like, competitiveness, right? I can see that going to a place of like, oh, well, okay, so you had sexual assault, as an adult. I had childhood sexual assault. And so, now we're talking about my needs. And that I think could be, instead of like a place we could come together and say, oh, wow, number one, this stuff is really common. Number two, we both have this shared experience that we can maybe deepen our bond over. It could become corrosive.
Yeah. Is there a next step, is like, not to say that, hey, it's our third date, maybe the two of us should, like, sit down with a third party or something like that. But is there a third element? Is there an external element or factor that can be introduced to ameliorate the situation and not just leave it up to these two people to wrangle with themselves?
That's a great question. I wish that there was something that came to mind, right? Like a common shared resource that people could go to and say, like, okay, let's get some support here. But I don't, other than, like, if you have friends and people in your life who know your story and are able to hold space for you, you could go to them as a potential couple, right? You could do this as sort of a group conversation, but that's going to be a pretty rare group of friends,
Yeah. I mean, I remember back in the day when you would date somebody and it was in college. Okay. And then now we'll take a joint trip to the clinic for testing.
Right.
And that was a bonding experience, totally. An outward show of trust kind of thing.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem like there is anything that exists in this realm.
No. And I think, like, the kind of the elephant in the room that we're sort of, like, talking around without meaning to talk around it is this idea that that sometimes it's the first date and you're there for sex, right? And so, what can you disclose comfortably? What can you receive comfortably from someone else that would enable you to continue that date as you planned?
Yeah.
Because we're kind of talking about like dating as if all dates become relationships and you're building something and whatever. But it's like, if you are someone who's had violence, or you have a sexual identity, or you have an STI that you need to disclose, and you are in this place of, okay, I need this person to know this before we have this encounter, but I don't necessarily want this to become like a therapeutic session, right? What are the parameters there? And I think that's like, no one talks about that.
Yeah. I'm seeing more and more in certain platforms like Field, where people are disclosing, like, I mean, it is an environment specifically for alternative. We say alternative, and that's not a fair term, but it's like complete honesty and complete disclosure. Kinks, predilections, wants, desires, and then also, this is my status. And that's something that also pops up in, same sex stuff too, is like,
right.
I mean, now it's hilarious. You've got, vaxxed and boosted, monkeypox on PrEP. Yeah. I mean, it's ridiculous, but it's full disclosure. And then also, also positive, negative, statuses as well. Right.
And whether people are poly and they're currently sleeping with other people. And, do you think that in that space, people are more able and willing to both like disclose and receive someone else's disclosure because these things are already like listed on the app?
100%. I mean, because the app, they are literally pull down options. And so when it's brought down to that mundane level of just checking a box of, I'm 5'7", this, and, brown hair. And then it's like, oh, and I'm vaxxed, or I'm on PrEP, or I'm, I have herpes. Okay, there it is. It's out there. And then there's a comfort on that side too, is that like any replies you get, it's all out on the table. And that is, I think, is going all the way back down to traditional dating, where it's where you're mining for data instead of already having it prior.
Right. And it's interesting to see how this changes generationally, because I can't remember if we were talking about this on the podcast last time, but I teach college, and so my students are like, they, day one, they come into class and it's like, oh, I'm a sophomore and I have developmental trauma and panic disorder right in front of class, And so I wonder if, some of this is revealing our age, because to us, disclosing any kind of mental health status, even in the early months of a relationship, would be pretty scary, let alone on the third date saying, you can't put your hands on my neck because I've got a previous experience with, sexual assault.
The vanguard and the person holding the lantern in front of me when I came out at the, at my age was my 14-year-old daughter.
Yeah.
And it was on coming out day. And I told her, and she just shrugged her shoulders. She's like, I know. She's like, she's like, okay, all right. I'm like, all right, moving on. Guess
was that anticlimactic?
Oh, it was. I mean, everything about coming out at this age in 2022 has been anticlimactic, because you build it up, and nobody, through your whole life, and nobody gives a shit. And then you find out the other thing on the flip side is that, oh, it's not a scarlet letter. It's actually somebody may find it attractive. Somebody may find it, hot. Like, wait, what? Right. So the changing mores and, the levels of communication are abundantly refreshing right now. And that is really reflected. I know a lot of people just crap on dating apps and things like that, but these ones that are essentially dedicated to hooking up and dating honestly, it's the dialogues within them are nothing but healthy.
Yeah, because everything's out in the
Yeah.
open.
Yeah.
And it's interesting too, because we've just sort of kind of stumbled upon this idea that there's this huge spectrum of responses. So if we go back to the date and you're at the table and you've got something to disclose, whatever that is, maybe you've
Yeah.
had, the trauma of the experience and then also the trauma of other people's bad responses.
Yeah.
And so you're sitting at the table and we've got this huge spectrum of responses where on the one hand, someone could kind of could dismiss you, right?
Yeah.
Which is, I think, where our fear minds go to first and say, well, I can't possibly, that's too much. You're too much. There's something wrong with you. But on the other hand, it could be almost dismissed in the opposite direction, right?
Yeah.
Which I think points to the idea that like your intention in that conversation has to be clear and not tied to the other person's response, because their response doesn't say anything about you. It says everything about them, which is so easy to say and so hard to remember in these tender moments. But if your intention in that conversation is simply to be honest and disclose to your level of comfort, then you have checked all of your, mental health boxes. What they respond with is always going to be a question mark, and it could fall anywhere on that spectrum.
You talked about the brevity of introducing it and being on the low volume end of the spectrum. How would you introduce, if you were doing it on an app or in a conversation, what is the language you use? Like, I'm a survivor, or I've been a victim of trauma. How do you just write it down on a cocktail napkin and slide it across the table and go, I'm just leaving it in 2 or 3 words. And if you want to talk about it more, I'm great. What are those?
Yeah. That's a great question. And this is going to be, I think, an unsatisfying answer, but I think you have to choose the language that fits you and your experience. And so some people really resonate with the terminology around survival. Other people really resonate with the terminology around being a victim. And there's a totally valid argument on either side. And so I've seen people disclose kind of in a humorous way because they feel like that's like an empowered stance to take. And I think that can be very powerful, but I wouldn't recommend that to everybody, because if that doesn't feel empowering to you, then that's not going to be empowering. So I would sit down and again, like think about 2 things. What are your intentions here, whether you're disclosing on an app or in person, or in a phone call or whatever. And 2, what language do you feel like fits your experience? It's so tempting to kind of reach for language that other people use, but like check with yourself. Do you feel like the word survivor is not, going to fit with the way that you feel about that experience? Same with the word victim, right? And disclose as much or little as you want. Like, I think that's the huge thing, is placing the autonomy back in the hands of the person who's had trauma. This is a choice. You don't owe anybody an explanation of what you've been through.
And on top of that, empowering the person on the other side to ask questions. Like, you put it out there. Okay, they may ask the clumsiest fucking question that comes to mind, but be prepared because you've put it out there.
Yep. And try to handle yourself and that other person with grace, right? This could be the first time they're having this conversation. And so not everybody knows to keep their facial expressions in check. Sometimes people have, really intense responses, and then they can walk back from that, right? Like, leave a little space for that. And if you can't, like, that's where you are, right? And that's important to know as well.
That's a great point. Okay, so that's the initial disclosure. The second scenario.
Yeah. So here's what I'm thinking here, right? You're in a relationship that's sort of like, I don't know, you're a year in, maybe 2 years in, a couple of years in, whatever. And something has happened, something's coming up that you didn't expect or realize was a trigger. Because I think we need to talk about these situations, because we talk about triggers as if we know all of our triggers ahead of time. And we know some of them, likely, especially if you've done some work in the space. But it's totally possible for you to have triggers that you don't know about. And so you're in this relationship, you feel this trusting bond, and then something happens and you're triggered and you're like, oh shit, now what? So the example that I thought of here was like, so let's say your partner is bothering you about working too much, and you feel really triggered by this because a previous partner did this and it actually had negative consequences both for your career and your relationship. And so you're in this now place of like, okay, I know cognitively I'm in a new relationship. I know this isn't my past partner. They're doing something that reminds me of the past partner. I'm having an outsized reaction. This is going to cause conflict, likely. This person doesn't necessarily even know that this was a thing, right? Because that's not necessarily something that would have come up when you're talking about past relationships. Now, what the hell do you do? Does that make sense as like a possibility?
It does. I mean, as somebody who has been married a very long time, you know, stuff doesn't start getting real until year 3 or 4.
Right.
And certain things come up and, you know, I don't want to say it in a cavalier fashion, but the bloom does come off the rose, and then you have to start intellectualizing stuff. You have to start being like, okay, this is, and now there is a cost benefit analysis of where I want to go with this, how I'm going to handle it.
Yeah.
And oftentimes in marriage, it just leads to, you know, shitty suppression tactics and just, you know, jamming it down and not dealing with it. So please, I get it 100%.
Which we're going to talk about in a minute with the long-term relationship, because that's exactly kind of what I had in mind for that. But so I think here, the really important thing, here's the thing, we don't learn how to have conflict. This is not something that we teach in the schools yet. This is not something that we figure out. And so I think when we are faced with something like this, we feel like we only have one choice, or actually we have 2 choices, right? We can stuff it down, as you mentioned, kind of, you know, sweep it under the rug, pretend like it didn't happen, go forward, carry some resentment, see how long we can carry that. Or we feel like the only other option is to blow up the relationship, right?
Yeah.
Oh, see, here's the sign. This person is exactly like this previous partner. This is exactly what I didn't want. Fuck this, we're done.
Totally and binary. It's a total binary situation. Yeah. Okay.
And there's so much, if we can walk into conflict, even if that relationship doesn't work out, walking into conflict helps you figure out your way around conflict in relationship, which is a necessary tool for a long-term relationship. You can't have a long-term relationship that has any value without conflict. And if you don't know how to argue, that's a huge problem. So I think, so let's say you're in this situation, you notice, like, so your partner is like, oh my gosh, get off the computer, it's 10 o'clock, like, why are you still working? And they might not even mean anything by it, but you're all of a sudden like, your shoulders are going up and you're tensing. Take some space for a minute, think about it, try not to respond in the triggered space, because we know we don't have access to the full spectrum of our rational brain when we're triggered. And then circle back. Explain the backstory, detail how the trigger happened, and say something like, this involves you, but it's not about you, right? This is a really tricky thing for couples, like, because we assume if I've triggered someone, I've done something bad. That's actually wrong in 2 ways. Number one, you can't possibly know their triggers. So it's not like you did this malicious thing. And number 2, when you trigger someone, they have now an opportunity to work through something. Triggers are not things we should avoid. They're signs of something that needs to be integrated. So saying something like, you know, this is about you, but it doesn't come from you. Or like, this involves you, but it's not your fault. And then explain in as rational a way as you possibly can. This is what went on in my last relationship. This is what it did. When you said that thing last night about, you know, me getting off my computer, I just was brought back to the past in a way that really surprised me. Can we figure out a way to communicate around work boundaries in a way that feels more comfortable to both of us? And then again, if you need to, take some space, because it's likely that your partner is going to feel defensive. That's a natural thing. I didn't mean that. That's not what I said. I'm not that person. How dare you, right? All these things come up. Can you pause and then again circle back with some thoughts if your partner needs to process, and then make a plan together about what comes next. I hate the language of like negotiation in relationships, but it's a negotiation. right? Just
Yeah.
because you have a trigger doesn't mean that your partner doesn't get to have any boundaries or needs. And like those boundaries and needs don't trump over the fact that you had a trigger. You both have to come to the table and say, okay, here's the negotiation. I would love it if you had a cutoff time of 10:30, unless there's an emergency. Could you tell me that there's an emergency and you're going to need to work late so that I can make a plan for my evening?
Yeah.
Whatever negotiation works for both of you.
That brings to mind, I mean, my own personal experience. Had an incredibly gifted and wonderful, sweet therapist early on in our marriage who gave us the tools. And you may know there may be an academic underpinning or in literature, but when you cannot articulate conflict at that moment, it breaks down to four things. And my wife and I used it, was you're either mad, glad, sad, or afraid.
Yes.
And there were times when my wife would say, I'm afraid right now. And it was sort of like a whistle being blown in everybody.
Yeah.
It's like, okay. And that was, I'm mad right now. And then it was also, there were really good days where it was like, I'm really glad, I'm really happy with this. But just having that one word that was sort of this, this kind of a pistol crack that like, okay, we're going to leave this on the table and then we can come back with it. It was a really useful tool. Yeah.
I love that because I think, and I constantly think about this, like when was the last time, if you hadn't gotten that tool, when was the last time you said a sentence like that to another human being? I'm afraid.
Yeah.
Right? Like.
Yeah. You wouldn't. It would be, you would try to expand on it. You would try to, having that one word was extremely valuable because instead I would have over-explained, tried to couch the situation, thrown the situation away, taken the heat myself. But then on the receiving end, when your partner says, I'm afraid, oof, man, then you get defensive. Then you want to help. Then it's like, what did I do? But having that tool explained, going, this is just a starting point. Everybody calm down. Everybody take a breath. And then we can, form our thoughts after that.
I also think, I'm a huge fan of low stakes tools when relationship conflict is really terrifying. And so if you're not used to using this language around your partner, is there anyone in your life you can practice with, right? Where you have a text conversation or a conversation in real life and you just say, I'm mad, right? Not at them, not just about work. I'm glad, I'm afraid of whatever. Because I think the way that we do emotion in this culture is to manage it and assume that it's basically a solo activity. And so that makes this disclosure of I'm scared really loaded on both sides, right? So you, as the person disclosing it, feel really intensely vulnerable. And as the person who's hearing it, feels like you've done something horrific. Right. Yeah. When in reality, I think if we were more used to talking about this stuff, it would just be easier to say, hey, we had this conversation yesterday, Paul. I'm really glad about that.
So we are talking, we're talking about really controlled situations and real sensible people in moments where they can give time to expanding on this. Yeah. But it goes to that conflict resolution of, I'll put it in one big lump sentence. God damn it. Why aren't you hearing me? Why aren't you holding space for me? Don't you realize what I've been through or what's brought me to this point? Defusing that situation. Where do you go from there?
I mean, I think this is where, so I said kind of on purpose, circle back twice, because I think it's our most powerful relational tool. Because we can try to think about this. You can read about conflict, you can learn all these tools, but in the actual moment when your prefrontal cortex goes offline because you're so activated, you forget everything, right? And that's the kind of human folly. But I think if you have the relationship, or you have the tool in your relationship of being able to circle back, then you can repair and correct the conversation, right? Don't assume that you're going to be perfect at conflict just because you know this one tool, right? We're all going to have moments when we're so activated that we do things that we regret, that we say things that we don't see each other, that we, make it all about us, whatever. But I think circling back when you are in a rational space, the other thing and this tool is kind of like implicated in the circle back, is the pause. Whatever kind of attachment style, whatever your Enneagram, whatever your astrological sign, I don't care. We need to understand that a pause is almost always necessary in a conflict, because when we're in that space of activation, nothing productive happens.
Okay.
And I think like people are like, oh, but I'm just someone who I have to have a fix right away. No, right? When you're dealing with another human being, you have to, this has to be a negotiation. And the pause needs to be articulated, again, as a negotiation that both people are comfortable with. So how long is the pause? I need 30 minutes. I need to walk around the block. I need to talk about this tomorrow, right? Those, I think, these things are critical conflict tools that I wish I hadn't, learned in high school.
Yeah. And I think it comes back to, it's not about me.
Right.
This person is processing. It's not about me. It's
right. Right.
You may be the only person in the room when this came up, or you may be the catalyst, but don't become self-absorbed that you can fix it or you're the core of the problem. Right.
It's each person has their own path, their own past, their own needs. And I think that's a fact that has to be maintained. So I think, as you just said, like reminding yourself, this is not about me, right? When you're in that situation, like if you were saying to me, MC, you were bugging me about work and I'm really triggered, my instant go-to as someone who talks about these tools all day, every day, is to be like, what are you talking about, Paul? I didn't mean that. Right? I immediately get defensive. And so like, don't make it the goal that that's going to be your like instinct. It isn't.
Yeah.
But if in the course of an hour of us going back and forth about that, where you're trying to say how you felt and I'm trying to say I didn't mean it, can I like somewhere in 60 minutes say, hold on, let me pause,
I just had a scenario. I know we were discussing the stages within a relationship, but there's one that it just popped up, was somebody who, let's say they are 27 and they are a victim of violent crime. Mm-hmm. It changes their life. It changes the neuroplasticity is, is different after this experience. What do they do at 28 years old, 9 months, 12 months later, when think we're feeling good, think we're doing that? They're in the process of healing, but yet we still need to live. We still need to have connection and still date. We were talking about people with legacy trauma and things that have happened in the past that we've built into our core, but fresh stuff, and then still integrating real life.
Yeah. I mean, I think, you said it in the question, which is neuroplasticity. So we're actually using this word malleability now instead of neuroplasticity, because plasticity kind of suggests that if you imagine a plastic and you melt it and it reforms into another kind of shape. They're kind of realizing that that's not the best way to think about the brain, because what's actually happening is that our brain is changing all the time throughout our whole life. And so I think the first step is to understand that your brain and your nervous system are malleable. So whatever happened is not fixed, even though it may feel like it at the moment. That's not like rendered somewhere forever in a particular way that's going to result in a certain behavior. And I think that's the first step. The second step is giving yourself and the people around you grace with that, right? We live in a culture that is so afraid of trauma that when I go give a corporate presentation, they don't want me to say the T word. right?
Really?
Because they're afraid of what's going to come up in the employment space. And so, like, I think we're also bad at this, understanding that trauma impacts not just the person that went through it, but also it kind of reverberates through their whole, whoever else is in their life, right? Friends, family are also impacted. And so that all needs to kind of be taken into account. And everyone, I think, needs to be given grace to do that integrating work, which happens over time and step by step. What kinds of safety can you bring in? What kinds of like feelings of empowerment can you bring in on a daily basis that can help sort of continue to shape your brain? Does that make sense?
It does, especially the thing about it being malleable, because with that malleability, you can go 3 steps forward and you're healing and 2 steps back. It's ebb and flow. And,
Totally. Yeah.
And I think that that's one of the, not putting my journey into it. It was not a single line of trending success to get to a point of healing.
Yeah.
There were some epic shit shows in between and falling back and forth and feeling like it was never going to change.
Yeah.
And to have somebody holding an environment and that it was okay, that failure is baked into this.
Yeah.
And so that requires malleability.
Yeah, totally. Did you, and this is after a violent crime?
No, it was after suicide attempts and and everything else. So yeah. And then what was so interesting about that experience was that the people that the friends close to me are like, wow, I'm so glad you made it to the other side, but I don't know how life is going to be the same after this for you. Yeah. You might as well just rewrite the script. And I was like, that was bracing. Yeah.
Did you feel like that was was that a welcome truth, or were you like, thanks, that's not helpful?
It was a little from column A, a little from column B. I mean, you knew the reality,
right?
But it was I want to see if I can fix this. I want to see if I can make everything better. And I'm going to step up to the challenge. And then somebody going, I've looked at the odds. They're not that good. Was a weird space to be.
Not super affirming.
Yeah.
We do, I think, we do a terrible job at so many things in the space of trauma and grief, but I think, suicidality and suicide attempts, it's the very worst, right? Like being able to even talk about that and have people not have an immediate, like, stop, hold on, we can't talk about this. It's so ultra taboo.
I didn't know what was going to be harder for, we talk about this year for me. I thought me coming out as a bisexual male was going to be the hardest. What was actually hardest was me openly discussing suicide ideation and me dancing with that dark side. Because, and then I thought about it, I can't do anything about my sexual identity. That's me. I was born with that. Accept it, move on, embrace it, celebrate it, move on. But in our culture, you could have been a little bit tougher. You didn't have to go to suicide. You could have sucked it up. You could have, and that's the way the brain works. It's like, oh, one is an option, one isn't. And I took the weaker option, and then the shame, and then boom, 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 you start rolling down the hill. And I think that in a relationship, that's why you don't want to disclose it, because somebody will be like, that's a personal choice. That's your failing. That's your weakness.
Yeah. I think that's the space that reveals the deep necessity for us to start talking about the parallels between physical illness and mental illness, right? Suicidal ideation is mental illness. That is a real thing that you did not cause, you cannot control, you didn't choose it, right?
And temporary, because you're branded. I mean, I know you work with, people in the federal penitentiary system, correct? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So people getting out of prison have done their time, they are still seen as offenders, as criminals, as that, even though they've done what has been asked of them. And, it is I may be speaking in a very cogent manner, but it will always be a fear of mine that somebody now knows this information about me. And it was like, oh, God, it's too bad. It'd be cool, if he was whole.
Yeah. Yeah. Deep dark.
Yeah.
Because
that's right.
If you had, cancer and beat it, nobody would be celebrated. Everyone would be doing a victory lap. Oh, you're such a hero.
Yeah.
Right? We actually use the language of you're a hero. You beat it.
But the most affirming thing is people sharing quietly, like, oh, I'm so glad you told your story. It was so inspiring. In a corner, of the party. Hey, can I talk to you for a minute? It's not like, woo, hey, look at you. No, it's like, hey, can I talk to you for a minute? I want to share something. It's wonderful to now have that out there, but to have those two examples that you brought up be so, and that is what we are afraid of constantly in engaging in relationships, especially now in the third one that we talk about is the long-term relationships. There may already be fractures unrelated to your trauma. And it's like, shit, am I going to, is this going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back?
Right. And how? And that's a beautiful segue. So in a long-term relationship, so now in the third phase, so let's say something happened early in the relationship and you swept it under the rug, as we talked about, as we often do. That's what we're taught to do with big things like this. Conflict is bad. So sweep it under the rug and move on. And we get tricked into believing that we're okay. Right? Because things, life marches along, the relationship continues, you have good moments. So you're like, that's fine. I don't need to talk about that. We don't need to circle back. It's gone. It was 10 years ago until it pops up because the stuff waits for you, right? It doesn't just go away. If you don't integrate it, it just waits. And so, what do you do when you're in a long-term relationship? You're in year 15, you're in year 20, you have now shared property. Maybe you have children. There are legal bonds between you. The stakes are higher. Yeah. What? Because I think on the first date, you can say, well, see you later. I'm out. Right. But in year 20, that's a lot harder.
Yeah. That was an interesting question that I just had on my podcast with Rena Martin talking about ethical non-monogamy. I go, that's probably an easier thing to slide in at the beginning of the conversation than retrofit a long-term relationship and say, hey, let's give this a shot. Right. And with that said, oftentimes the trauma in long-term relationships is infidelity. If it happens early on and then you've moved past it and it's like, okay, we've moved past it. We're, everything's good. And then that will erupt.
Absolutely. No, that's a great example. And I think, the thing here, and I'm not often this prescriptive about this, but go to therapy.
Yeah.
And I think here's why. Since this happened, in the relationship, the likelihood that even one of you is going to be able to get enough external perspective to get an objective view on it is slim to none. And you really need both parties to be able to get to that space. So without a third party, without a coach or a therapist, that's going to be pretty impossible. Even if you're both therapists, right? We just have blind spots.
Which is probably even more which is even worse.
Totally right.
Doctor, heal thyself. No, yeah,
exactly. So I think going recognizing it, bringing to the table. I think we need to be a lot less scared of couples counseling as a culture because we have this assumption that if you go to couples counseling, it's because you're in trouble. But I think it can be an incredible growth opportunity. And bringing this to the table with someone who's an expert and can help you sort through and see what your blind spots are and help you kind of figure out how to move forward. Because there's going to be work on both sides of the equation, no matter what the equation looked like. Mm-hmm. Right. So if you have infidelity that happened, 10 years ago and it's coming up because the partner who was betrayed is kind of still bringing that up into conflict or into conversation, or they're feeling triggered by something, they have work to do. And nobody wants to hear that or say that because the person who's been betrayed, they assume that there's no work. How could there be work? I didn't do this. Right. Well, continuing the relationship, you signed up for, now this is something you have to integrate as well. And that sucks. Like, I'm not saying that, like, you know, I'm not trying to say that lightly, but a therapist will be able to say, okay, here's your work, person A, here's your work, person B. This is what this structure is going to look like. Let's come back together and work out whatever else comes up, you know?
I've always thought marriage vows should be changed to sickness and mental health. Because it's like, let's put that on the table. Because it's not all about the body going bad. It's about, most of the time, it's the brain having some issues over the years. So, yeah, mental health is going to be the one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And being afraid of bringing that in, again, like, draw the parallel, right? If you started having like some mysterious pain in your shoulder or something, your wife would say, like, look, Paul, like, you got to go to the doctor. And if you refused, now you're doing something to the relationship. It's not just about you. And so it's like, you know, we've got to be able to draw the parallel and say, if something's coming up for me and I'm being triggered, I have to then be willing to go to therapy, and you have to be willing to go to therapy. And therapy is not a scary place. And this is going to be, if we have a chance to move forward without resentment, it's most likely going to happen in that realm.
That's so funny. That's a great example. I mean, how many of us have the cliche of the henpecked husband whose wife is watching his diet, you know, for his cholesterol or his diabetes, you know, that's her job. That's what she does, you know, but nobody's ever doing, have you done self-care? Have you seen your therapist? Have you done this? You need to. Come on, be good to yourself. That is not a dialogue that is had in most marriages. Yeah.
Or, hey, I'm noticing you have no energy. Your passion is gone. You used to laugh. Like, these are things that our intimate partners will see and recognize from the outside much, much more quickly than anybody else. Why can't we treat these as real valid issues that we should go, you know, check out?
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Okay. So taking it all the way back, and with John's book, Single on Purpose, where actually, the mission of that book is that when you're single, there's no better period for growth and expansion and being your best self. Do you have to get your trauma and handling that all under control before you set out? Should you?
No.
Okay.
Are you surprised by that answer?
No, I'm not. I wanted to see how emphatic that answer was, because I agree. I mean, that's ludicrous to make that demand on somebody.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also just that when we talk that way, we have the wrong frame on what healing actually looks like, right? We do a little bit of healing alone. We do healing with other people, right? The most powerful healing happens in relationship. And so you can listen, take space if you want to and work on yourself. Like, I'm not saying don't do that, but don't have this like limitation on yourself that you have to sort out all your trauma, figure out all your triggers, be like healed, right? Before you have the audacity to get into a relationship. That's just not what happens. And I've seen this. Like, I have seen clients take, 2 or 4 years off of dating, and they go into this like cave of self-discovery. And they do a lot of growth. They do a lot of reading. They do a lot of research. They do a lot of work. And then they go into the world, and with the assumption that now they've done the work, right? And they interface with another human being, and everything falls apart, or it feels like it falls apart, because they're not this like well-honed, cured machine, right? That's not how this works. When you're face to face with another human being, stuff comes up that couldn't possibly when you're alone reading a book.
Yeah.
So work on what you need to work on to feel comfortable interfacing with other human beings, right? And then give yourself some grace and also the acknowledgement and knowledge that when stuff comes up in a relationship, it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you, the other person, or the relationship. It just means stuff is coming up. Can you think of that as an opportunity to heal yourself, the other person, the relationship, instead of this like damning statement of your worth?
And so the takeaway is that your healing should be holistic. It should not be monastic, like you said, going away and all that stuff. It should be holistic. Yeah. Where you're still interacting.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. We integrate forever. Our little brains and our little memory, the hippocampus, which is in charge of our long-term memory, is refiling stuff all the time. So like this idea that we like integrate something and then like check a box and we're done that's not how that works. That's biologically impossible.
Well, I think that's a great place to put a cap on it.
Yeah.
Thanks, MC.
Thank you, Paul. This was lovely, as always.
MC, where can everybody find you?
I am on Instagram at MC Ph.D, EMSEY Ph.D. And I have my website is alchemycoaching.life. How about you?
Everybody can find everything to know about me on smartfunnytortured.com. And that's the same for my Instagram handle.
Awesome.
All right. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Talk soon.
Bye.
Bye.
I hope that episode was helpful. Hey, listen, if you want to share your singlehood journey, if you've gone somewhere and come back, if you have revelations and wisdom, please share your story. It's going to help other people. Nothing makes us feel more connected than hearing other people's stories. So just send me the audio of your story, and you can just record it directly from your phone and email it to theangrytherapist@gmail.com. Also, if you want our Single on Purpose newsletter, go to singleonpurpose.life. That's singleonpurpose.life. You will get tools and articles and other people's stories, and also Zoom links to private gathers. So if you want to join our community, go to singleonpurpose.life. Thank you for listening. Be well. We hope you tell a friend.
I am currently 36 years old. I met my now ex-husband when I was 17 years old. We got married when I was 30 and were married for about a year and a half until one Tuesday night he decided he'd had enough. I quickly spiraled into a deep black hole, could barely function, and even had one night in hospital after an OD. Then one day I decided to make a change, and I decided to go traveling, which was something I'd always wanted to do, but being in a relationship and being too afraid to be on my own. This experience traveling on my own completely transformed my life and my relationship with myself and the world, really. So here are the top 10 lessons I learned during that experience. Number 1, yes, that was shit, but what are you going to do about it? In other words, you always have a choice about how you're going to respond to something. Number 2, yes, it's hard, but not doing it is harder. Change is hard, but ignoring the fact you need to make a change in your life will only make life harder in the long run. Number 3, the world is full of so many good people. You only need to spend a few minutes, have a genuine conversation with someone to see that. Number 4, fear is pretty much bullshitting us all day. Number 5, it's okay to be lost and have no idea what you're doing. You just have to try. Number 6, trust yourself. Number 7, then trust the universe. Number 8, let go of the delusion of control. Number 9, you are guacamole, so don't let anyone ever treat you like free salsa. And number 10, forgive yourself.